Myroslav Shkandrij, yes.
I cannot read I cannot, have to do these things because
Okay, I'll try and keep this short because it's been a long day and a long session and a very a conference that's been full of interesting information and new insights. I know about the publications that Kius has done, has an impressive record. It's got an impressive research record in this field, but I'm really even more impressed by what happened at this conference, the kind of people they've brought together, Kius has brought together, the possibilities for interaction in the future, the ability for archives to really enrich everything that is associated with Holodomor studies. The perspectives that can be offered from different collections, by different collections, in various languages, in various locations, outside Ukraine. One of the interesting themes that has come out of this is the possibility of cross-referencing experiences, the Holocaust and Holodomor, Jewish and Ukrainian, Mennonite and Ukrainian, Polish and Ukrainian, Romanian, Moldovan interactions. These are all fascinating and eye-opening possibilities. I was also impressed by the amount of unused material that is still available, that still needs to be looked at. So these comparative projects, the amount of material seems to be a direction we should be thinking of going. As for themes, it seems to me this. I'm not going to talk about individual papers. There's no way I can go through all these papers and congratulate people and say how good they are. But I will just talk generally about themes. The aid sent from Ukraine, aid sent to Ukraine. Where did it come from? How was it sent? What were the obstacles to it? It seems to me that by comparing the experience of different groups, you get important insights into how these projects worked and how the Holodomor looked different in different parts of Ukraine. Another theme that seems to me to have come out of this is the attitudes outside Ukraine. We heard about ideologists, journalists, letter writers, how each of them was concerned often with their own agendas, their own groups, how sometimes they treated the situation in Ukraine with less sympathy, with more sympathy. I thought that was an interesting aspect that needs to be further developed, the aid and how it was organized. Then there's this fascinating theme of governments, which came out very strongly in the previous day. This macro political level, the fact that governments definitely knew, and we have this insights into the U.S. archives, into archives in other countries. And the politics, intergovernmental, international politics, which worked to silence, minimize, obscure, or deny the extent of the Holodomor. There was a couple of fascinating presentations, one on Germany, one on Japan, one on Poland, and this sort of idea of analyzing the intergovernmental, international political situation as being crucial for understanding how the Holodomor was approached, was described, and ultimately how it was blocked from a wider understanding. That I found really new. And I can see really interesting, fascinating research avenues into foreign policy, into interaction between governments. And one thing that came through very strongly was the fact that 32 to 34 was a crucial time in European history, and it had a huge effect on European and world history. In the it led to the enormous international conflicts that, or it contributed to international conflicts that came along very shortly afterwards. I also found it very interesting, this importance of optics, how governments, non-government institutions also tried to control information, put a spin on the media. In the 30s, as in later decades, it reminds you of what's going on today. And also, as Paolo Fonzi said, the fact that the Holodomor was too cataclysmic to ignore. The fact that ultimately the information had to come out. So the amount of spin did not, in the end, prevent the information from coming out. Very interesting to me, too, was the role of individuals. We heard we know a lot about Duranty, but the whole description of Herriot was very interesting. I also found it might be worthwhile spending time on some of the more positive journalists, the people and the reporters and the government people who tried to put out the information rather than on the negative. That's another area that seems to be ripe for coverage. So all this is important because right now we're living through a period when films are being made about the Holodomor, programs are being made, documentaries are being made, books are coming out, where we now are looking for heroes as well as villains in telling this story. So for future topics of research, I can see a lot. One of the episodes that struck me was this description of women's revolts. I never even thought of that. I never thought how that would even look. It was a very vivid description and a very interesting angle on showing the resistance and the grassroots kind of reaction to what was going on. Many of the stories have been told, but the nuancing that came out, the supplementing of narratives was very intriguing, and I mean, it's important to supplement what we already have with these extra points of view. In particular, I was, as I said before, was struck by this manipulation of public information set against the background of this turning point in European and world history, how the major states were interlocked in a way that allowed each of them to either minimize or ignore or try to ignore the Holodomor. So the awareness of the scale of the issues, the critical importance of state actors, for me, came through very, very strongly. And maybe another phrase I'll mention, I think Myroslav Shkandrij and Olya Natyuk talked about creating the Soviet Union trying to create a preventive war in 1932, a plan to destroy the Polish state. This, for me, is very interesting, very important. It changes my perception of what the Soviet Union was about and what Stalin was about. So these complexities in the state actors, Germany, Poland, but also Japan, I found really, really intriguing. The fact that all these people were concerned with Ukraine, realized the importance of Ukraine, and were looking for ways of influencing developments there. So for all these reasons, I think there's a lot here that breaks with traditional conceptions and traditional patterns of approach. We have, well, it seems to me anyway, from my perspective, we've spent so much time talking about how many died, Was it a genocide? How bad Duranty's was as a reporter? The ignorance of the West. Well, I think what I've heard at this conference completely disproves that last attitude that the West was ignorant. And it has moved us into a different way of thinking about, open up possibilities for thinking about new ways of talking about the Holodomor. We can now compare evidence from these various sources. We can compare experiences of suffering in various groups within Ukraine and outside with other groups that were studying the problem. We can compare reactions outside Ukraine, how different communities and different governments looked at what was going on there. And also, we can focus on what Ukrainians were trying to do. These attempts to influence governments, to bring attention through the League of Nations, through other bodies, the relief efforts. I must say, I haven't read a lot. I haven't studied this in great detail, but I haven't seen a lot about the relief efforts. And what was said here, I think, by various people, was quite informative. Why some relief efforts were almost successful, were partially successful, but how a lot of them were unsuccessful. But the sheer amount of effort put into this, to influencing governments, influencing European bodies, and trying to send materials to Ukraine was really fascinating. What's missing? Well, when I was thinking about the presentations, I thought about, who exactly in the Ukrainian community was doing things, was active? Why were they active? Who exactly was contacting the Japanese, for example? What sectors of the Ukrainian community were involved in contacting Germany or the League of Nations? I know there were tensions within the Ukrainian community. There's competition within the Ukrainian community. Would be, to get a finer picture of what both the relief and the protest efforts were doing. Be very important to look in greater detail there. A lot of other I had written down as one of the topics that nobody's touched, trauma studies, until I heard a couple of the last presentations, which broached this idea of the aftermath. Was very interesting, and also the psychological traumas that have affected people. I don't think we've spent a lot of time on that at all. The idea that future generations can suffer. That we all carry a certain burden. I also didn't see a lot about rescue missions, and there were rescue efforts. I have to tell you, you probably know this if you've followed the discussions in Canada on the Holodomor, but in Winnipeg there is a Mennonite family. One of the victims of the Holodomor, a man, traveled to a Mennonite colony, to a Mennonite group, and actually they took him in and he became a Mennonite. And he kept quiet until a long time afterward. He got married, raised his children as Mennonites, and now we have a family in Winnipeg. They now know that they were of Ukrainian background, and they come to all Ukrainian events, and they're very much aware that they actually were the people that rescued this family. Another really interesting topic for me, one that I didn't see a lot of here, although I also didn't attend the visit to the monument, is the ritualization, the way we commemorate the Holodomor, the kind of rhetoric we use, the phrases we use, and how the Holodomor is sometimes used for political reasons. There's a lot of material there, I think, that we didn't hear about. even the nature of the monuments, the kind of monuments that are put up, where they're put up, how they're put up. That's a really interesting avenue of exploration. Also, the institutionalization of research. This did come up, but I think it's worth stressing. We collect this material, we organize these materials, we digitalize this stuff. Who's going to use it? Who's going to write the books? Who's going to do the research? You know, if we're losing professors, if we're losing positions at universities, we don't have the people that are going to research this stuff, write on it, teach it. We need to think also about that. It's not just a question of collecting stuff. It's also a question of how you can keep the research going at a high level. But I don't want to talk strictly about the things that are missing, the gaps. I think we also need to celebrate the achievements. All this work that I've heard about done in the archives is wonderful. The collecting of eyewitness accounts, the digitalization, which is very important, of materials. I think that's terrific. And also just the fact that the proceedings of this conference will create a volume of essays. I think that will be an invaluable tool for all researchers in this field. It shows you where to go, where the materials are, how to access them. To the best of my knowledge, that's not available, and it should be. It's a guide to future research, to new topics. I was also really thrilled at the end to hear about the photo analysis of photos. That's terribly important in this visually oriented world. The fact that we can analyze these photographs, have real research behind them, a research that cannot be discounted. This is a controversial and a poorly analyzed topic, so that's terrific to hear. And lastly, the psychological effect on us, on future generations that Larissa Zasiekina talked about. That's a really unexplored topic for me. That's closer to my field, which is one of my fields, which is literature. And it made me think of an essay by Viktor Petrov, the scholar Domontovich, who wrote at one point, he read Hamsun's book on famine, on hunger. And he said, Hamsun doesn't know a thing about hunger. And Hamsun won a Nobel Prize for this book. He said he doesn't know a thing about hunger. And I was really struck by that. Ukrainian intellectuals all knew about hunger. They knew about famine. They knew the symptoms. They knew the progression. They knew the traumas. And some guy like Hamsun who goes off and starves himself for 3 days so he can write a book about hunger, to them it was comical. I suddenly thought that in literature, Ukrainian literature, there's a lot of that kind of experience. People have written, Olas Samchuk wrote a good book about famine in the 30s. Then there's Vasil Barka, who wrote a book after the war. There are some really interesting accounts by people who knew a bit about what was going on. That would be really interesting to combine with some of the psychological analysis, the trauma analysis. When I was thinking about this, I suddenly realized we don't have literary studies of any of this, but it would really add to a whole bunch of approaches. Then the last thing I was thinking about was collective memory and cultural memory. It's really interesting to look at how Ukrainians have, first of all, collected this information, and secondly, how they've begun to institutionalize this memory. These are really important factors. In the trauma analysis, in the psychological analysis, I started thinking about lesser suffering. My mother was a Holodomor survivor. She was from Donbass. But Donbass was relatively protected. They didn't starve in the same way as they did in most of Ukraine. In fact, people came to the Donbass asking for food. But my mom, when during the famine, she would have been about 9. She wrote an essay in which she described in the winter dragging a sledge around, going from village to village, from family to family, collecting food. And, I thought that was, she never talked about that. That was interesting. It wasn't that big a deal for her. She survived. But also, I remember her saying she would have been an inch, she lamented she would have been an inch, maybe 2 inches taller if it hadn't been for the famine. So, it's part of family history. And it's part of her, trauma that she was dealing with. But my mom was also taken as slave labor to Germany and spent 2 years as slave labor on a farm. And she told me that she stopped menstruating for 2 years because of the stress and all that. So you have trauma upon trauma, and you have people who sort of have to. One trauma can sometimes push out another trauma, and then they have to deal with that as they come to Britain, post-war Britain, and they have to work in factories. A third trauma, and learn the language and all that. I feel that there's sort of the experience of second generation, like myself, and the experience of people who went through a kind of partial famine, sort of a lesser suffering. It could also be part of future research. Anyway, those are just general comments. I would like to say this has been a remarkable gathering. It's been quite eye-opening for me. There's lots of information to process, lots of perspectives, many insights, pointing the way to future research, and it's tremendous stimulus for further scholarship on these subjects. So I'd like to thank everybody who helped organize and contribute to this conference, and to congratulate the Institute on a good job.